Hi everyone, Simon from Horoma Studio. Here we are in the final installment of our short webinar. I hope you've learned some interesting stuff so far. In the previous videos, we've seen how to choose your trees wisely and how to place them in a clever way to enhance your composition. In this present video, we'll now dive into the real fun part of the process, which is basically integrating your tree seamlessly into their surrounding. For some of you who are familiar with my work, you might know that I've done an extensive article on a similar topic on how to integrate people cutouts seamlessly. And you'll see that the tree cutouts are actually quite similar in terms of workflow, although there are some particularities that we'll tackle in the present video. So let's start. Here we have like a rendering we're going to use as a base. So that you've seen in the previous videos probably. The idea here is, so all the different trees have been placed. So as you can see, there are quite many of them. Here we have 3D trees for the background, and then we've added trees one by one in order to build up the composition that I talked about in the previous videos. One thing first regarding the folder structure. So I always have the same folder structure for my PSD files. So there's like the vegetation back, which are basically all the trees and stuff that are going to be behind people or behind glass or whatever. So in this case, it's mostly the floor, not the ground. Then we have all the adjustment that helps in creating like a better lighting. Then we have all the people thing. And then we have the vegetation again. And then we have another set of layer to tackle the lighting again. And then there's like slight effects that are basically like LUTs and color balance and fog and stuff like that. If we go back to this vegetation layer, so all the trees are properly placed. What I do basically is that first I have like this, I have adjustment layers that I put on top of everything and clip to the main folder. So that basically if I really don't have time to add adjustment layers on each trees individually, I'm going to basically add like a brightness contrast. So this first one is quite important because it basically helps you in decreasing the contrast on, I'm just going to add something like this to explain. It helps in decreasing the contrast in the background area because, as you know, the contrast is going to be much more intense in the foreground and it's going to decrease in the background because of basically the atmosphere that sort of adds a layer on top. And usually the atmosphere is sort of like bluish, which means the hue of your trees in the background is going to be slightly like bluish. The other thing I do is then adding like a curve adjustment. So this one is the same, like, even though you could basically have the same result with curve and brightness by playing around with them, I like to have more control and sort of have basically all of them and just like tweak them. Like if you see here, it's just a slight curve. So the changes are not that much. Level here is because I usually use them for the extremes, basically, and like black and white, so that I make sure that I don't have burnt areas on my cutouts. Then the burn and dodge tools are like really like basic ones, but that are really important because basically they're going to help you in reshaping the light on your trees. So say, and the good thing is that since it's on all the layers, it means you can basically do it on, it's not what I want to do here. Basically means you can redo the lighting on like each, basically here you can burn things on the left and dodge a little on the right and recreate a completely like a more intense lighting, for example. Here, of course, I'm doing it like in a completely wrong way, but you get the idea. Like if I turn them off, the lighting seems completely flat. and it only took like 2 layers, and you just have to paint on top of each of your tree here, and you can completely recreate an interesting lighting. As you've noticed, I'm working in black and white at the moment. Then when I arrive at that kind of, at these 2 layers, what I do is I switch to this, which is basically a saturation layer. So what I do, I usually desaturate most of my layers because usually cutouts are too saturated. And here it's more of a, that thing that is weird. Here it's more of the hue of the overall trees. So here I can see I've got some orange and some blues. So basically what I could do is to just like turn them into something more green or something more red, etc. So it's basically up to the what you want to achieve with the image, but also it has to be consistent throughout the whole image. So you can't have like a green tree everywhere and just like one single tree of the same species be like completely red or something like that, because it wouldn't make sense. So basically we're starting from that and ending up with that thing. So basically the idea here in terms of saturation is to make sure that the saturation of your trees is not too important, because basically in an image saturation is supposed to be quite homogeneous, and the most saturated part is usually the sky if it's like a bright blue sky. Otherwise you can have like vegetation that is going to be brighter, but still it's quite rare. So something like that. One extra thing to take into account when you're dealing with basically cutouts, but especially background cutouts, is to double check that what you do is you don't get this sort of white strokes that is usually around cutouts when you make them much smaller. Here in our case, we don't have that problem because these guys come from Forest Digital and they're like really precisely cut, so it's fine. The other thing you have to take into account is to match the basically blurriness or the resolution between the cutout you have and your rendering, because of course you know your rendering in the background part is going to get a little bit of noise, and the resolution is going to be like, here you can see we can't see the pixels, whereas if we go into our foreground here, the pixels are much smaller, or the same size, but it's get what I mean. So what you want is to actually take the time to double check all your trees and sort of add a tiny bit of noise. So it's pretty simple, like you select this guy here, which is that one, and what you do is you add, so you go into filter, noise, add noise, and then you just have to check like the amount of noise you have to add. So here it might be a little bit too much, but you get what I mean. Like you just have to check how much noise you have to add to match the noise you have in your background. In the rendering it's okay, but if you're playing with like backplates and stuff like that, you're gonna end up with like a much more visible noise. So this is something you have to pay attention to so that it matches nice. You can have like use a monochromatic one, and you can use uniform or Gaussian. Basically I don't think it has much of an impact. Just use whichever you find fits better on the image. And the other thing you can do is also, but I think it works less, is to add a little tiny bit of blur, but I think the noise is usually enough. But what you could do is just to add blur, Gaussian blur, and add like, maybe it's usually going to be like in the 0.2 or 0.1 pixels, so it's really tiny. The same principle applies to cutouts of people. It's basically for any cutouts, because they're usually really high res, whereas if you take like a really high res, whoops, That's not what I want to do. If you take a really high-res image and you then scale it back, scale it down, and put it in an area that is like much lower resolution, you're still keeping many more information that you originally had in this area. So that means you have to add a bit of noise and a bit of blur and a bit of basically tweaking so that it fits perfectly. So just be careful not to forget that step. So next step, we're gonna have a look at the next step of integrating a tree. So we're going to choose that guy here, which is that one. This one here. So one thing I like to do when I integrate trees, especially hero trees, it's less important in the background, but is to basically, here you can see it's not really convincing. Like, you could do whatever you want, like even like use like a grass tree, grass brush or whatever. It still has like, this doesn't look really realistic. So what I do is I usually go into my basically a library of trees that I have, and I pick one that has like a nice junction between the floor and the tree, and what I do is I try to match it. So I have this that is basically this image at first that I've sort of cropped with a like simple manually cropped with a layer mask, and I add it in at the bottom of the cutout. What I then do is try to match the hue and saturation, because obviously it's not from the same image, so it's going to be quite different. And then what I do is add a series of small adjustment layers just for that specific tree. Here it's grouped because it's two different, like there's the bottom part and the upper part. What I could do is actually merge everything, because it doesn't really matter. So I could do that, and I could do that, and I could get rid of the group here. The shortcut to do that kind of thing is really important. It's Ctrl-Alt-G. So it helps you in clipping like the selected layers to the layers below, which is quite effective. So as I was saying, there's like this saturation thing here. Then there's a color balance that sort of matches the overall color balance of the tree. Then there's the level. I don't know if I'm using that one. Not even. That one is a curve adjustment that sort of plays with the greens because of basically the color of the base. And the most important one is actually that guy here, which is basically the same as the dodge one here, except that I do it individually and it's clipped again on the layer below. And this one really helps in merging the lighting of the lower part here, which already have some sort of highlights here. That is nice because it fits the sun orientation of our rendering. And it also helps in merging the upper part. So basically it's like a really simple layer. So these guys, I haven't talked about it, but it's like a 50% gray. So what you do is you create a new layer, go into fill, select 50% gray, do OK. And then you just have to set it to overlay. And in that case, in that way, you can use burn and dodge tool in a non-destructive way, which is really, really important because they could really massacre your image if you don't use them properly. So at least that way you can sort of go back if there's ever a problem. The next part is regarding the shadows. So what you do is you select your cutout, you duplicate it, so you can press Ctrl-G, and what you do is use Ctrl-T, so to make a transformation, choose distort, and then you have to, well, eyeball it basically, because you can't really do much. So here, if we look at what it looks like, here we have that. So what you have to do basically is to match the direction from the existing shadows you have, because you can't make it go all the way like that or all the way in a different direction, because it will look extremely weird. Also, you have to make sure that the angle is the same, because, well, you can't make it go like all the way up here or all the way like that, because it wouldn't make much sense. So here you have that kind of angle. So if you take it from here, if you want to do it like really properly, you can actually draw like the line basically. So you'd have that sort of thing here that does that, and you could sort of play around and have something that's sort of like that. So it looks okay from what I've done here. So usually the thing that people do that is quite wrong is so they have their shadow here, and what they do is it just like paint it black or whatever, and they're like, yeah, okay, that's good, and I just like decrease the shadow opacity and it's gonna be nice. So like I can do this, and they'll be like, yeah, it's good. I like to do it another way because it sort of fits more the physical way that it behaves. So basically, instead of just putting it black, because actually shadows are not black, shadows are lower value and a slightly different hue. So basically, instead of having like green with black, what you're going to have is darker green and a slightly different hue, which is going to be usually like shifting to some blue or purple, depending on the hue you have. So what I usually do is I create an extra layer, a hue adjustment layer that I put in the below everything, so you can see it's not in the cutouts folder. And what I do is I basically, when I have all my cast shadows, I select them and I add them into this layer. So what I do is I basically add it here. This one is the previous one, so we don't need it. When I have my shadow here, what I can also do is usually either blur the whole thing. So if I go into like add a Gaussian blur, which is an acceptable way of doing it, although the thing is, as you probably aware of, is that the blur should be like a gradient basically, since here the distance is really small, the feathering is going to be quite small, whereas the feathering is going to be bigger here. So what I usually do is that I get the what's the word of that guy? Blur tool. It's quite self-explanatory, and I just use it manually on my layer, and then that way I can sort of control where I want it to be really blurred and where I want it to not be too blurred. So that's pretty simple. The other way you could do it is if you sort of, instead of doing it here, is that you first did it on this layer, put it into a smart object, and here if you use like a Gaussian blur, you're gonna have this smart filter here, which will enable you to sort of erase the blur in some parts and put it back in some other areas, so that you could have this sort of slight progression from this part to this part, which could be interesting. And then you just have to basically rasterize the whole thing, and then you'd have the right selection. What you want to do with this new layer is to basically, what you can actually do is add something here, just so that you can basically compare it easily with another thing. Like we can add something here and be like, have it just next to it, and basically we have to match that sort of spot here with that other spot here, which you'll see is not that complicated. So what we do here is then we add this saturation layer. So here you can see the saturation seems to be quite okay. So then we have to match the hue, which, well, it seems the hue is already quite there. Like you see, you have to get this sort of purple thing. So that would be actually okay. And then you can double check here and see that it sort of looks good. If you look here, you'll see that it also looks pretty good. Saturation is the same, and the hue is also quite similar. So that's good. So basically this means that the shadow we have here in terms of hue, saturation and value matches the ones we have. Then of course you have to double check some aspects of it, which will be like this kind of area here where you know it's actually, there's no shadows here. The same happens here. So you have to check like for every vertical planes in the image that you're not casting shadows in a non-realistic way. This guy can go too. So as you can see, we've started from there and here and got to something like that, and that. Could actually maybe decrease a tiny bit intensity, because that's the thing, is like, you know, the value is going to decrease a little because of the atmosphere that is in between the point and its cast shadow, because here we have more atmosphere in between, whereas here there's like only like a meter or something. Anyway, so that would be like the main thing to take into account when you blend a tree.
As you can see, this is a quite long list of aspects to keep in mind. Let's do a quick recap of what steps you need to go through once you have finished placing all your tree cutouts and want to start inserting them. First step is to match the lighting of your overall image. Turn your image at black and white to better gauge the values. Then you can start playing around with brightness, contrast, levels and the curves adjustment layers. The main idea is that contrast decreases with distance. My two favorite adjustments are burn and dodge tools that help you in giving a more dynamic look. Second step consists of matching the hues of your trees. If you have diverse cutouts, make sure the foliage is quite consistent and that the overall hues fits the temperature of your scene. You don't want cold hues on your trees if you're in a sunlight warm scene, for example. Also, be careful when tweaking the hues of your foliage that you don't include the trunk, otherwise its hue is going to change too and it's going to look weird. Third step is anchoring your trees. This is only important for hero trees that are quite visible in the foreground, for example. Take the time to add a realistic junction between the tree and the ground and to match the light and hues of the overall tree. Also make sure to use the same species in the base trunk you add, because irregularities in the trunk aspect will stand out. Fourth step is casting the shadows. Simply duplicate your cutout and distort it so that it fits the sun direction of your rendering. Make sure to blur the cast shadows to the right amount depending on the intensity of the sunlight. The easiest way to gauge it is to look at rendered shadows in your image and try to mimic them. Once your shadows are cast, instead of painting them black, copy them in a hue saturation layer and adjust the brightness, hue and saturation to fit existing rendered shadows in your image. If you don't have shadows available, keep in mind that the shadows are usually darker, slightly different saturation, and a different hue, which is usually toward blue or purple. The final check you need to go through is to check noise and resolution consistency throughout your image, especially for cutouts you've placed far in the background. A high resolution cutout will stand out quite a lot from a low resolution background, and the discrepancy will catch the eye. As you can see, this amounts to quite many steps that you'll have to repeat for each cutout tree. This can be cumbersome, which is why I've developed a quick script that does all the heavy lifting, creating the right layers and folders, all the needed adjustment layers, as well as casting all the shadows in a set direction. This will basically help you in saving huge amounts of time, since you can use that script for vegetation as well as people cutouts in your scene. There's a link in the description if you want to find out more about it. With that being said, I can now conclude this small webinar. I hope you've learned some interesting tips and tricks throughout the different videos and that you'll be able to integrate them all in your day-to-day workflow when it comes to the topic of vegetation. Thank you very much for sticking with me until the end of this short series of tutorials, and I hope to see you in another webinar. Cheers, guys!